Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is part 3 of the debugging tips and tricks using C Sharp. Today we'll be talking about an interesting feature provided by Visual Studio Debugger called Make Object ID. So lots of time we have faced a situation where we are debugging a method hierarchy, and deep down into nth level of the hierarchy, you wanted to access object or variable which existed in n minus 1th method. So what do I mean by that? Let's take an example of the same solution that we have been using in this series. I just added an extra class called entity processor, which is nothing but simple class that goes through each property of the entity provided, and then it processes the type which is provided to it. And there is nothing crazy in the class itself. It's just like a console write statement where we are printing out the property type name. So let's try to debug this. As you can see, we are about to hit the very first method, and this is where we will be processing first entity. Now, here is what I'm talking about when we talk about the variable and the object being out of context. Currently, we can see we have entity object variable in the context, which is also part of auto window, locals window, and watch window. This is where I have added it manually. And if I try to get to the properties of that object, I can see that fine. Now, the crazy part is, if I do F5, we are only passing the property info object here instead of the entity itself. So if we want to inspect the entity at this point, it is not possible because that entity object is out of context and the current method execution is no longer referencing the object. But there is a workaround, or I should say, there is a way around it, and that is the feature we are talking about. So let's try to rerun this project. All right, we are here. Let's continue. At this point, again, we can see the entity object itself is in context. So what we can do is do a right click and select the option called Make Object ID. When you do that, you should see a $1 as you are seeing on the screen, which means now Visual Studio allows us to reference this object not by its name, but by its address indirectly. What do I mean by that? So if I try to execute the flow, we are in a nested method where we no longer have a reference to this entity variable, right? So that object is out of context. But if you do $1 here and hit enter, there it is. So now, even though the method no longer contains the reference to that variable, we can still access that variable. The object is available for us. And this is the really cool feature if you are debugging so many methods and somehow you want to understand the object which was passed on the initial methods. And if you are in a deep down method, and if you no longer have the reference to that object, this is one way to do that. But I would suggest one more thing here. As this is available by reference, you can still make a change to the object itself, which is something you should really be careful about. Why? Because let's go through an example here. Let's say I'm just changing the first name to upon here. Oh, yeah, sorry, my bad. Okay, so as you can see, I just changed the first name property of that object by its reference. And if I go back to my parent method, If I look at the entity, there it is. You literally change the value of the property, your object, outside the scope where a method can reference it. So this is something where you should really be careful about. Um, Most likely, you will not be facing a situation where you have to change the value of the object properties, but something to keep in mind. In most likely cases, you will just end up referencing just like this. And yeah, one more thing. This is not only possible in the watch window. You can do this in the property. Sorry, in the locals and in the autos windows as well. You do a right click, make an object ID that kind of creates another object with new integer ID. Uh, this is more like a new reference ID created by Visual Studio itself. So something to keep in mind. And let's try to reference that here. Yep, there it is. So thanks for watching. Um, I'll see you in the next one.